G'day folks, thanks for tuning in. Today's video is another in a series on colour theory. This time we'll be exploring black. Now black can be very straightforward in that you could just use black and white paint. But by using colour theory we can create a range of subtle and visually interesting effects that read as black even without the use of an actual black pigment. In a previous video we painted this Darth Vader, and the only actual black paint used was on the helmet. The other various materials were instead built from foundations of complementary colours such as indigo and brown. Similarly, the black on this Venom was largely made from mixing greens and purples, and highlighted with warm and cool hues to modulate both colour temperature and saturation to keep things interesting. We can also adjust our value scale depending on the material we're trying to replicate. For example, this KS2O has a broader value scale where the highlights and shadows are more abrupt, to represent his metallic body. So we'll be focusing on both chromatic black as well as a grayscale option using this Black Spinel. Being a higher grade paint, it has both decent opacity and staining properties, but you could substitute in most black paint for this, such as ivory black that comes in most starter sets. We'll be working exclusively with titanium white for our Black Spinel Marine, and the other two will be built from a foundation of indigo and Dyke brown. One will highlight with brilliant yellow pale, and the other with radiant blue, to explore warm and cool highlights. Yellow and red are also out for things like weapons and lenses, but we'll mostly be working with the darks on the right. Now let's get started. Like always, we'll be laying a foundation with cheap size 8 round brushes. The more mangled the better here, and we'll be using just a cap of odorless thinner to thin our paint as needed. I'll be working over Vallejo Grey acrylic primer so you can see what I'm doing, but I recommend working over a darker primer, even a black one, for a much easier time. I'll expand on this more as we go. So we take our thinner and start with our Black Spinel, and apply it liberally to the mini. We want it thin enough to get into all the recesses, but not so thin that it's a wash. I've started out too thin here, but we can bolster it just by adding more paint. It's easier to gauge this in our progress in general with a lighter primer, but since we're aiming for black, we'll need to be more careful when wiping this layer away. A lot of our brush strokes will be a lot more visible too, and will take more work to manage down the line. That's not to say that you shouldn't, just that there are pros and cons to every approach. We'll be covering the whole marine here, weapons and all. For the other two marines, we're going to mix indigo and Dyke brown to make that chromatic black. Now it can be hard to tell on the palette how close you are, but since oils are forever mixing, you can easily test on the model and adjust accordingly. With this first one, I'm going for a more bluish black, leaning more into the indigo. Conversely, our last marine is going to lean towards brown. This is an organic process, so just play with it. If things get too saturated in one direction, just add more of that complement to bring it back towards neutral. Now if you wanted to get fancy, you could push for a bluer black in the shadows and a warmer one for the highlights, but for this demonstration we're going to keep it a bit simpler. And for the bases we're just going to apply Dyke brown. As a more neutral brown, it'll go well with our desaturated marines. Depending on your basing material, you may need to add more thinner so that the paint gets down into all the recesses. And here they are. The differences are subtle, which is something I'm going to be trying to maintain throughout, but as we build on them they should all start to take on a more distinctive look. If you're working with a light primer, then you want to be very delicate with this step, as while they all stain, what's left behind is still transparent. That being said, the more paint we do leave behind is going to make our layering more difficult, as less is always more with oils. The goal is just to make a value sketch here, leaving less paint on the areas closest to our light source. Here you can start to see more of the differences. The Black Spinel and brown focus marine are closer together in both temperature and hue, but I'd be hard pressed to call any of these something other than black. Next we're going to apply our initial layers. Our filbert brushes are up next to allow us to quickly and efficiently apply these initial layers. I've recreated our 3 foundations on the palette so that we can make our mid-tones before committing them to the mini. Our paint will of course blend and darken down as we apply it, but I find this approach helps gauge things for darker schemes like black. Broad gentle strokes from top to bottom, letting it blend as we go. We're going to be focusing more on re-establishing shadows than making highlights in this video, and because we're going for a smooth reflective armour, we want our initial highlights to be quite bright by contrast. Our indigo heavy marine will be getting brilliant yellow pale for his highlight, as the yellow provides somewhat of a contrast to the blue, both in temperature and hue. And our brown marine will be getting radiant blue for the same reasons. In all 3 cases we're a long way from white in terms of value, but in the context of the mini these highlights are still quite stark. We work our way around, applying this layer generally from top to bottom. By overbrushing like this we can generally preserve our shadows, particularly in the recesses, and it's those recesses that'll be providing our reference for our darkest value. For both interest and consistency, I've used the same respective highlight colour for each base too. Again, the difference is subtle, but having the same coloured light helps bring things together. So as much as we need light to define our shapes and elements, we're looking far more grey than black at this stage. So next we'll be re-establishing some shadows over our foundational colours. Thanks to the blending properties of oils, we can come straight back in with our foundational colour and still leave ourselves room to go darker. Here we want to block in areas that we want to shade, and then come in with a clean dry brush to blend it all together. We can easily get a nice smooth gradient like this, as well as blend out some of our more visible brush strokes. Now you could layer and blend as you go, but I find it more efficient to block in first, and then come back in with a blending brush. This takes more faith and I don't always abide by it, but you can see the difference in areas where I try to do both at the same time. It really depends on the look that you're going for. This is another area where the lighter primer can work against us. On the inside of the legs where the paint is thicker, the blending brush is less effective, and can even tear things if I'm not too careful. It's important to regularly wring out your blending brush, or have spares on hand to minimise this. For the sake of demonstration, I'll be focusing more on the upper parts of the marines, but hopefully you get the idea. Now our gradients are looking better. Next we're going to be using pinline washes to reinforce our recesses and re-establish some definition. In this step we're heavily thinning down our foundational colour, so that we can gently tap it against our areas of separation and let capillary action do the rest. A long thin brush like this lyre is recommended here, as we want to minimise the amount of contact with our raised parts. The right mix is going to vary from paint to paint, and it's a game of fine tuning. If you do get spillover, or if it just sits on top, don't worry, we can blend that out later once we've given the thinner a chance to evaporate. You can see on the left how important it is that we tap and not wipe here, as all that thinner can erase out work if we're not careful. It's nothing we can't fix of course, but it is something to be mindful of. Now our shadows are looking a bit more dramatic. We need to let the washes sit for a few minutes before we can do cleanup, so next we'll be working on the weapons and trim to give our black some much needed context. I've opted to make the weapon casings red here, and we'll be starting from a mix of Fanchon red and Van Dyke brown. The black on the model will further desaturate and muddy things, but a good strong red like Fanchon will still win out. Same as before, a filbert brush to block things in and establish a bit of a value scale at the same time. We'll come back in with pure Fanchon red for a lighter, more targeted layer, and again with some cadmium yellow mixed in for those edges. The filbert brush is really versatile like this, and with a bit of practice can tackle both flats and edges with ease. The same scheme will go on the lenses, which you can see me do in several of my other colour theory videos. The metallic parts are straight indigo, followed by brilliant yellow pale for the highlight. This is my go-to for many metallics, as it gives us a nice blue-grey that we can easily modulate. For these final highlights, a liner brush can also come in handy. For the trim, I wanted something near to white that could also complement the black. We could do this by taking our respective highlight colours from the armour and applying it more or less directly. White, brilliant yellow pale, and radiant blue, with some white mixed into the latter two for our final highlights. Suddenly our black armour looks a lot darker next to these lighter elements, and while it's still largely grey, it's looking more suitably so. Next we'll do some final highlights to further push that contrast. What I'm going for here is to further push the highlights to sell the reflectiveness of the armour. When dealing with black or white, a lot of our definition is going to come in the extremes of highlight and shadow respectively, so by keeping these last highlights both abrupt and restrained, we don't run the risk of further greying out the model. We're still not going 100% white just yet, as we want to keep that for our sharpest edges and corners, but this near white mix is still quite stark when applied. We can use our blending brush to smooth out our chunky lines, and also craft that round specular highlight on the shoulder. Our indigo and brown marines are getting the same treatment, with brilliant yellow pale and radiant blue respectively. As these colours aren't as bright as white, you can also add some of that for the final highlights, depending on the look you're going for. This is a step you can spend a lot of time going back and forth on. Oils also have a tendency to cure darker than they appear when applying them, more so if you're going to varnish them, so don't be afraid to really push the contrast here, remembering that if you're painting for gaming, they're mostly going to be seen from a distance, so more contrast is usually better. This is something I still find challenging, as when you're up close like this, it's easy to worry about how it looks in hand versus how it'll look on the table. It's also another reason that I love oils though, as we can easily make significant adjustments with very little effort. And here's our final result. Even over a light primer you can still easily achieve a decent black with oils, and you don't even need black paint to do it. As grey as they looked early on, the context provided by the weapons and trim really pushed that back down, as did just a few minutes of refinement using some simple techniques. And here they are a week or so later after they've dried, on the turntable after being varnished, so you can see the kind of difference each step makes. I hope you enjoyed this one and found it useful. I always like working on black, trying to refine the process and make it more interesting to both paint and look at. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you very much for spending time with me here today. If you have any questions about any of the products or techniques I've talked about, or have a topic you'd like me to cover in a future video, I'd love to hear it. Again, thanks very much for your company, and take care.